IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. India and Russia have just signed 28 different agreements following a high-profile 2+2 summit. A joint statement that the two countries also released also states the goal of turning their commercial defense relationship from one in which they're buyers and sellers into one in which they're both development and manufacturing partners. The visit also highlights the importance that both countries accord to the relationship. India has so far used the 2+2 format, which involves not just heads of government, but also foreign and defense ministers, only with its Quad partners so far. Also, this was President Vladimir Putin's second trip abroad since the pandemic. He was in India for a total of 5 hours. So you get a sense of a high priority relationship. But what is the future of this relationship? Where does it go from here? And how much was really achieved in this summit? To discuss all this, I have with me the man who tracks all things Russia, Aditya Pareek. Welcome, Aditya.
Thanks, Aditya. It's great to be back.
So, Aditya, several agreements do seem to have been signed. And there also seems to be some sort of path forward for the manufacture of AK-203 rifles in India. But that's a fairly minor agreement or project to go ahead with, right? So can you tell us some of the most significant things that have happened in this recent summit, and what would it actually take for India and Russia to become major defense R&D partners?
Be glad to, Aditya. So from what I understand, about 28 agreements were signed, and this is not just between the governments, but rather all sorts of entities, including joint stock companies and research institutions, upskilling institutions, that sort of a thing. And obviously the cold, hard cash is also speaking. So there's a bunch of hydrocarbon agreements, long-term agreements about supply of oil between Rosneft and ONGC Videsh Limited. So I think the biggest strategic takeaway that I have from this meeting is the fact that, at least on the energy security agenda, Russia and India's relations are quite warm, and the Russian Far East's hydrocarbon wealth is definitely something that India is happy to help Russia extract and get financial benefits from, so that India can also ensure its energy security. COP26 and the whole climate agenda notwithstanding, I think energy security is something that Russia and India are cooperating on quite a bit. And for the defense deals, at this point, it's just all data points. When you talk about the AK-203 deal, it looks like only minor setbacks were there in the past as well, and they were supposed to be cleared. The pandemic delayed this meeting from last year to this year. There was no meeting last year, so because of the pandemic, and people were talking about how there were other strategic implications for it not being held, how India and Russia are actually geopolitically diverging because of their inherent national interests, how China plays a big role, that sort of a thing. But, it was just a pandemic. The heads of state were just not visiting each other. That's just how the world was working for a year or so. So the meeting was delayed, and people, started talking because that's what people do. And since you asked about the AK-203 deal, from the reporting in both the Russian and Indian press, that I'm seeing that finally the hurdles have been, conquered, and about 600,000 of the rifles would be manufactured for the Indian Armed Forces in India, in a factory in North India. So I think, that's another data point to add to Russia-India relations in defense ties going forward. But, there is also this one thing that I'm pretty bummed about, is the fact that they didn't sign the reciprocal military logistics support agreement, RELOS, which I was very, very much looking forward to. So that's a pretty bad thing for me at the moment as an analyst, because, just doesn't give me much to build on. When I argue for Russia-India relations, it would really have to be looked from another geopolitical perspective of balancing ties with the US, because you have a slew of similar agreements with the US. So yeah, I wish that agreement was signed right now, but yeah, they've put off that.
Now, Aditya, the summit also seems to have happened at exactly the same time that deliveries of the S400 have commenced and are apparently set to continue. Can you tell us what the timeline is for S400 induction, and also how much are India and Russia going to worry about the US CATSA sanctions?
Be glad to. So the S400 system has been purchased by India, and the deliveries are just now beginning. So it was almost like leading up to the summit. So components have started arriving in India right now, but for the system to actually become operational is still going to be, I think, a few years ahead, because it really is a multi-layered high-tech air defense system, and you can't just, on short notice like the Rafales were inducted into the Indian Air Force. And I just don't know how operational they are, what kind of loadouts they're flying with, or how just how operational they are, as opposed to say just they're making ferry patrols, that sort of a thing, simply flying without the weapons being active or anything like that. So you just don't know what kind of operational level the Rafales are at, even if the IAF has said that they are completely operational or whatever. But I don't think a very similar parallel can be drawn from the deliveries of the S400 system components can be made, because that system would have to be precise by its very nature. So the S400 deal, as we know, was sort of controversial in terms of the US taking that up with India as something that they could be sanctioning India for under the countering America's adversaries through the sanctions at CATSA. So that's been a kind of a fulcrum point that people point at, that hey, if the US sanctions India, it's going to result in US India ties deteriorating, and the fact that the US is somehow trying to paint India as this biggest part of the bulwark against the Chinese in the Indian Ocean littoral region, that would, not really, that sort of approach by the US would not benefit. And if I recall correctly, there are some national legislations in the US Congress by Republicans even, who are trying to give India a waiver on the S400 deal. But, I don't think it's something that would be a one-off, because India has this policy of strategic autonomy that we all very well know as people who study IS. So strategic autonomy would always make us choose the systems and their, consequences of buying those systems on a case by case basis. So if an S400 system, or in the future an S500 system, or, well, you'd never know, even if a Noodle system was offered to us, I wouldn't put it past India that we won't consider it if it really boosts our national security posture. So I think the US shouldn't think of India as the US shouldn't behave so jealously. India cares about its interests first, its national security interests first, and the hardware, the equipment it buys is going to reflect just that. So if you don't have a system like comparable to the S400 in terms of THAAD, it's just not going to work out. If at the price point S400 is offering better capabilities, more tailored to what we want defense from capabilities, I think India is going to go ahead and buy stealth frigates like it's doing with the Talwar class frigates, additional Talwar class frigates being built in Russia for the Indian Navy right now. We are going to lease SSNs. The US is not going to step up to the plate and offer us SSNs. I mean, I often say this. I've made this argument quite a bit, to both publicly and personally, that until the time US doesn't offer one of its Seawolf class submarines to India, I do not think the US is very serious about security cooperation with India, because the Russians just offer you more. They are offering you warships and submarines far more advanced than what the US is offering you. Well, arguably. And definitely, the Russians are offering you SSNs on 10-year leases. The Americans are not even ready to contemplate such a prospect. They're not going to give you nuclear propulsion technology. Well, you can see that they are, in fact, doing something very similar with AUKUS, with their Anglosphere allies like the US and Australia. So, yeah, India should also take that into account and think, if the Russians are giving you more capability, you really have an interest in keeping that alliance alive, keeping those relations alive. So I think the fact that the US administration has not made a definitive decision on giving India a CAATSA waiver speaks quite a bit. So India should, for the sake of leverage, even for the sake of pragmatic national interest, should always prefer to have a good relationship with Moscow.
Okay, Aditya, let me respond to that. Firstly, you characterized CATSA as some sort of act of jealousy. I think we flatter ourselves if we imagine that CATSA was directed at India. There's no evidence that that was actually so. Secondly, we talked about the US not offering, for example, Seawolf SSNs to India. There is no evidence that India has actually sought this out from the US itself. It's a different matter that the US may not want to share it, but it's not something India has sought after either. In a sense, India has already gone down its own path. It's trained and acclimated itself to using Russian SSNs and that reactor technology, and is now slowly developing its own technology, both for its SSBNs and its SSNs, based on that. So I'm not sure that even the Indian Navy is particularly interested in leasing out old American Seawolf attack subs. The other point that we should make here is that you talked about how the US is portraying India as the as bulwark of the Indo-Pacific. Regardless of what the US portrays India as of over there, the reality is that India is the largest state in the Indo-Pacific, and of all the states, it is one of the few that has any chance of standing up to China in any meaningful way. So regardless of what the US does, uh, India-US ties are going to grow anyway as long as China continues to be itself. So those things are just structural, and they're not the product of some American conspiracy or jealousy or anything of that sort. But we'll just get back to that in a bit. We'd like to. One thing that's really interesting for us to understand is what is the future of the India-Russia relationship, because obviously they are not what they were 50 years back. So we'll just discuss that right after this short break.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam Gupta is joined by Gopal Agrawal, Senior Fund Manager, HDFC AMC Limited. They talk about the latest new fund offer, the HDFC Multi-Cap Fund. On Probation Se Promotion Tak, host Abhinav talks about leadership and how it can be nurtured. On Fin Talks at Bob World, Akhil is in conversation with Mukesh Kaldra. Mukesh is the founder and CEO of ET Money, and they discuss how Indians invest. Join the Simplified Trio as they break down complex causes, effects, politics, and cricketing mishaps caused by the intense air pollution in Delhi. Yeah, you heard that right, cricketing mishaps. And on Edges and Sledges, Ashwin and DJ talk about the first test match between India and New Zealand and the 2022 IPL retentions. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, do remember that many of our shows are available on YouTube. You can check that out by going to our website, ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, where we have a list of all of our various YouTube channels. Finally, we'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, HDFC Mutual Fund, CoinSwitch, Cooper, Intel, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. Now, Aditya, you have long advocated stronger India-Russia ties, and you've already just made the case earlier in this episode. Can you give us an overview of what you think the key opportunities are and how this relationship can be carried forward? The reason I'm asking is it's now 50 years since the Treaty of Friendship was signed between India and the Soviet Union, and that was at a time of major strategic convergence between the two sides. Back in 1971, the US, China, and Pakistan were effectively on the same side. The US had basically was in the process of flipping China over and splitting the communist bloc. And so India and Russia sought better relations with each other. For India, it was especially important because it was about to go to war with Pakistan over East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh. But ties have really shifted since then. Since 91, you've seen the collapse of Soviet power, seen a revival of Russian power, but also greater US-Russia hostility, as well as heightened rivalry between India and China on the one hand, and the US and China on the other. And that has fundamentally, structurally changed the dynamics of international relationships. And we presently see India and Russia really on two different sides of this divide. We have very different ideas about the Indo-Pacific. We saw, for example, Sergei Lavrov criticize the AUKUS agreement. We've also seen, for example, India and Russia diverge on Afghanistan. And we've seen, for example, the Russians happy to do deals with the Pakistanis over Afghanistan. So there does seem to be a broad set of divergences between India and Russia, not and something that can't be easily fixed in a summit or by simply wishing it were so. Given these circumstances, what again, I'll ask you, are the opportunities for India and Russia realistically in which they can both deepen and widen their relationship? Because the other thing that is often said about India Russia relationship is that there is not much of a commercial content to it. There's only a defense commercial content. Most of the India Russia ties as you always point out, are in Russia's favor because Russia's the one selling us things. How can this relationship become more broad based and more durable?
Okay, so let me address a few things. So, first of all, let me plug in a recent piece I wrote for a business newspaper in Russia called Kommersant. So, it's my favorite publication in Russia, and I highly recommend that people check it out. Kommersant.ru. Will link my article in the show notes. And let me start by saying that I'm well aware of the odds that are stacked against the Russia-India relationship by the sheer numbers. So, if I can quote the trade figures, so the bilateral trade between India and Russia was envisioned to be around $30 billion or so around by 2025. And I think that figure has been met. That figure has been achieved, and a new target has been set of around $45 billion or so. I'll have to check for the exact number, but I think that's what it is. So compare that with the kind of bilateral trade for goods and services that the US and India have. That's $146 billion in the same period. So it really shows that the US and India are trading much more. And as you know, money talks far more, except for maybe national security. That's about the only caveat. So it's very natural that I am swimming against the tide when I talk about the Russia-India relations being strengthened. But I think there are key focal areas where it just can't be, wished away, that we could probably only think of our relationship with the US. So from what I understand, there are things that should be taken in consideration of as you talked about China. So that's our primary strategic challenge. I very well get that, and honestly, this is the primary line of argument that I pursued in my Kommersant op-ed as well. And there I have answered the question because I felt that in Russia this conversation isn't had from an Indian perspective. They always think of their a strategic partner with whom they have a very tentative alliance of convenience, China. So they always think things through from the Chinese perspective that, hey, the tensions between, there's this misconception that the tensions between India and China are some sort of a conspiracy whipped up by the US, and if things were left as they are, India would just shake hands with China, and this triangle of India, China, and Russia would be best friends forever. That's just not what the reality has been. And as you rightly pointed out, in the 70s as well, things weren't very different for India and China. There were tensions on the border. There were tensions politically, although China was, in the US camp in the 70s, breaking away from the Soviet Union. But, I have anecdotal stuff to quote. So in 1989 or so, around the Gorbachev era, the Soviet Union offered to Su-27 flankers, which were at the time not in service, but the most advanced fourth generation fighter, they offered not to India, not to their Warsaw allies, who were treaty allies. The Soviet Union did not offer their most advanced fighter to uh, these nations, India and Warsaw Pact allies, but rather China, as a sort of olive branch. That, hey, since you are kind of not in the US camp anymore, since a few years ago, maybe if we can restart our relations, would you take the most advanced piece of technology we have, defense technology we have? So India and Warsaw Pact allies at the time only had access to the MiG-29 Fulcrum. So yeah, that is one of those anecdotal evidences that I have narrowed down on, which you can use to say that, hey, Moscow, even during the Soviet Union's time, definitely knew the strategic weight of China and how it can counterbalance the US's weight. And whoever China throws its weight behind the Russians during the Soviet times and even today understand that it could change the whole power balance situation in the world. So, very interestingly, President Putin has recently said that Russia must acknowledge the rise of India as a great power. I get that, but actions should speak louder than words. And if the relationship between India and Russia has to be taken forward, the first need has to be that it has to be diversified. There's this problem that we've often discussed even offline of this podcast, that the India-Russia ties are pretty much about big ticket items, and it's about either hydrocarbons, it's about space, it's about defense industry, or then there's the multilateral agreements and that sort of a thing in the UN and stuff like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that sort of a thing. But, at the end of the day, if you're not trading enough and the bilateral trade relationship is, not a zero-sum game, but rather both sides are winning and it's a mutually beneficial relationship, only then can you count on your ties to actually last and actually be of benefit in the long term. So the first thing India and Russia need to do is stop thinking about only the big ticket items and to start thinking about stuff that is more, people to people as well. The Soviet legacy of how connected we are and all that stuff about Bollywood being popular in the post-Soviet space. I get that and that's appreciable. But hey, the kind of soft power that Hollywood holds, you really got to, put up a challenge to that. Only then can you expect the Indian people and Indian society to actually resonate with what you're saying. So it could be as simple as, the Russians make very good military movies. So a new movie came out recently about the Su-24 crew that was killed during an operation in Syria. So I think if, I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there. If the Russian foreign ministry would release that translated, dubbed version of that movie in India and screened it widely, I think that would, count towards some sort of outreach, cultural outreach that would resonate with a lot of young people like myself. So just putting it out there, things like that would really make a difference.
That's very interesting, Aditya. We don't often hear about the opportunities for example, greater cultural interaction between India and Russia, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was a time when people in urban India were, for example, quite familiar with Soviet books and so on. That obviously isn't the case anymore. And there's been nothing to fill in that gap. And so maybe that's one of the potential opportunities to, like you said, broaden ties between India and Russia. But thank you so much once again, Aditya. And we'll, of course, keep tracking the India-Russia relationship as well as everything that's been going on with Russia. That's one country that always remains in the news. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Aditya. It was great to be on the show.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.
Given the unprecedented times our nation is going through, where positive is now a dreaded word, Smile India gets you delightful news from across the country about people and places that continue to spread the much-needed hope and positive vibes. I am Shifa Maitra, and you can hear Smile India with me every Thursday on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Oh, and did I tell you Smile India is available in both English and Hindi.